the marriage of a goddess with a man. The wife of the god Hinagán is Dakao. She has no children except a daughter called Búgan. This Búgan was with her parents in Luktag. Let it be noted that these divinities of the highest region of the sky world do not see directly that which takes place in the lower spheres, but the first calls the second, and the second the third, etc. According to this order, the first or principal god, known as Bungongal, charges or gives orders to his son Ampuel, who in turn orders his son Balaton, and the latter orders and charges Lidum of the lowest sky region, Arkabunian. This Lidum is the one that communicates directly with the Ifugaos. The said Búgan, daughter of Hinagán, was at that time a maiden, while in Luktag, and her uncle Bayuibi told her to go down and amuse herself in the third sky region, Hubulan. So, according to the wishes of her relatives, she went down to Hubulan where Daladoan, the brother of Balaton, was. The said Daladoan had gone to Hubulan to marry another Búgan. The first Búgan, daughter of Hinagán, had been advised to marry in Luktag, but she did not wish to do so, and so they told her to go off and divert herself in Hubulan. Having settled down in this sky region, her uncles advised her to get married there, but neither did she wish this. In view of her attitude on this question, Daladoan exhorted her to descend to Kabunian, and go to take her abode in the house of Lidum her relative and the son of Amgalingan. The said Lidum wished her to marry in Kabunian, but she also refused to do this. Near the house, or town, of Lidum, whose wife is called Lingan, there was a village called Hobiatan, and the lord of the village also bore this name. Such being the case, the said Hobiatan went to the house of Lidum, and, upon seeing the young Búgan in the condition of maidenhood, he asked Lidum, "Why does this maid not marry?" The former answered him, "We have counseled her to it, but she does not wish to do so." I, upon seeing that she did not wish to get married, nor to follow my advice, said to her, "Why dost thou not get married?" She began to laugh. I replied, "Then, if thou dost not wish to get married in Kabunian, it were better for thee to return to thy people and thy family of Luktag." But she answered, "That is not necessary, and I should like to stay with thee in thy house, and I shall take care to get married at my pleasure, when I see or meet someone of my liking, and then I shall tell thee." Hobiatan, after hearing this story of Lidum, said to him, "According to this, I shall take the young Búgan to my rancheria and house in Hobiatan to see if she wishes to marry my son ggílît." To which Lidum rejoined, "If Búgan so desire, it goes without saying that she can accompany thee at once." The maiden, having been consulted, assented, and went off with Hobiatan to his house and village. Having arrived at the said place, and after Búgan had observed somewhat the young ggílît, as if Hobiatan had asked her whether she desired to marry him, she answered, "How am I to wish to marry him, ggílît, grim and fierce as he is, and making use of such an extraordinary spear? Moreover, he never stops, but is always running around in all parts of the sky world, through the north and the south, through the east and the west." And she told Hobiatan that she did not wish to marry his son ggílît, the lightning, because that through his effects he harmed plants, fruits, and possibly might injure even herself. Then said Hobiatan, "Thou art somewhat fastidious, and I see that thou couldst with great difficulty get married in these regions. It would be better that thou return once more to thy land." She answered that she did not desire to return any more to her people, and that accordingly she would betake herself to some other point more to her liking. This dialogue being completed, she went down from the house of Hobiatan, and, casting a glance at the 4 cardinal points, she saw that the weather was clear and calm, and descried on the earth a place called Pangagawan, over, or on, Umbik, where there was an Ifugao called Kingawan, a young man, unmarried, naked, and without a clout, which he had thrown away because of its age, because he was engaged in making pits, or wells, for catching deer with a trap, according to the custom, and there he had a hut. Upon seeing him Búgan exclaimed, "Oh, the poor man, and how unfortunate," and, hiding the occurrence from Hobiatan, she determined to return to her sky region of Luktag in order to manifest to her father, Hinagán, that it was her desire to descend to the earth world in order to get married with that poor Ifugao. The paternal permission having been obtained, she made ready the necessary provisions, consisting of a vessel of cooked rice and a clout, or bahag. In this fashion she proceeded to Kingawan's hut and entered it, saying, "Who is the owner of this hut?" "I," answered Kingawan, "but I am ashamed to approach thee, because thou art a woman and I am naked." To which she replied, "Never mind, because here I have a clout for thee." But he did not approach for shame, and so she threw him the clout from afar, in order that he might cover himself. The surprised man expressed to her his astonishment, saying, Why dost thou approach here, knowing that the appearance of a woman, when men are engaged in such an occupation, is of evil omen for the hunt? And she replied to him, By no means shall it come to pass as thou thinkest, but, on the contrary, thou shalt be extremely lucky in it. For the present let us eat together, and let us sleep this night in thy hut. Tomorrow thou shalt see how lucky we are in the hunt. The following day, upon going to visit the pits, they actually found them full. Ggáuan killed the quarry and spent the rest of the day in carrying the carcasses to his hut. He kept alive only 2 little pigs, a male and a female, which he delivered to Búgan that she might tie them in the dwelling place while he was bringing in the rest of the dead game. On the second day Búgan asked the solitary one, Why dost thou dwell in such evil places? Ggáuan answered her, Because my parents are so parsimonious in giving me what I need. Then said Búgan to him, Let us go to Kián, and he consented. Leaving, then, the dead game in the hut, they carried with them only the 2 live piglets. Ggáuan carried the male one, and Búgan the female one, arriving at the above-mentioned place on the nightfall of the second day. Having arrived at Kián, they took up their lodging in the house of Ggáuan's mother, the man entering first and then Búgan. The mother of the former was surprised, and asked him, Who is this woman? The son answered, I was at the hunting place and she presented herself to me there and I do not know whence she comes. The aged mother, after having looked at them a little while, when seated, addressed herself to Búgan and asked, Who art thou? How dost thou call thyself? From whence dost thou come? The maiden replied that her name was Búgan, that she was the daughter of Hinagán and Dachau, and that she belonged to the sky region of Lugtag. But the reason of her descent to that terraqueous region, and of accompanying her son, was her having seen him so poor and deserted, for which reason I took pity on him and came down to visit him and to furnish him with an abundance of game. And she added that on the following day the mother should send many people to collect the dead game which they had left in the lonely hut of her son. By a coincidence, the mother of the young man was also called Búgan, with the addition of Na Cantalau. During all this, the young couple had already been united in the bond of matrimony, without any of the prescribed formalities, at the place called Panggagawan, and Búgan gave birth to a vigorous son to whom she gave the name ggílît. The little pigs, also, which they had brought, gave forth their fruit. The child grew a little, but he did not yet know how to walk. His mother, Búgan, as a being from the sky world, did not eat like the rest of the people of Kián, but desired only boiled rice, birds, and meat of game. Those of that region bore her much envy because of her being a stranger, and, because they knew she did not like certain vegetables of theirs, they strove to make her depart from their town and to betake herself to her birthplace of Lugtag in the sky. Their envy toward her increased upon their seeing the abundance of her fowls and pigs. With the object, then, of disgusting her, and of driving her away, they attempted to surround her house with certain garden stuffs, greens, and fish. With these they succeeded effectively in making Búgan fall sick with an intense itch and fever, for which reason she abandoned that house and went to another place, while her husband moved to a rice granary. But they persecuted her again in her new place of lodging, surrounding it with the vegetables and other things spoken of above, and causing her nausea in a stomach accustomed to other food. In view of such wearisome tricks, Búgan proposed to Ggáuan her desire to return to her land with the new blossom of spring, their child. Her husband answered her, I should well like to accompany thee, but I am afraid of ascending to so high a place. There is no reason to be afraid, replied Búgan, I myself shall take thee up in the iud, a kind of hammock. She accordingly strove to persuade him, but Ggáuan did not lay aside his fear. Then she attempted to take him up bound to a rope, but neither did she effect this. During these labors, she soared aloft with the child to the heights of Lugtag, but upon perceiving that her husband had not followed her she went down again, with her son in the band which the Ifugaos use for that purpose. After conferring with Ggáuan, she said to him, Thou seest the situation. I cannot continue among thy countrymen, because they hate me unto death. Neither dost thou dare to ascend unto Lugtag. What we can do is to divide our son, and, seizing a knife, Búgan divided her son ggílît in the middle, or just above the waist, and made the following division. The head and the rest of the upper trunk she left to Ggáuan, that it might be easier for him to give a new living being to those upper parts, and she retained for herself the lower part of the trunk unto the feet, and as for the entrails, intestines, heart, liver, and even the very excrement, she divided them, leaving the half for her husband. The partition having been completed, Búgan mounted to her heavenly mansion, taking with her the part of her son which fell to her lot, and, giving it a breath of life, she converted it into a new celestial being retaining the very name of Belitug. On the other hand, the part which she had left to her husband, on the earth, began to be corrupted and decayed, because he, Ggáuan, had not been able, or did not know how, to reanimate it. The foul odor of the putrefied flesh reached unto the dwelling place of Búgan in Lugtag, and, having been perceived by her, she descended to Cabunian in order to better acquaint herself with the happening. From Cabunian she saw that the evil odor issued from the decomposition of the part of the entrails which she had left on the earth in charge of her husband, and which he had not reanimated. Then she broke forth in cries of grief, pity, and compassion, and, descending to Kián, she severely accused Ggáuan, saying unto him, Why hast thou allowed our son to rot? And why hast thou not quickened him to life? Upon which he answered that he did not understand the art of reanimation. Búgan endeavored to remove the greatest possible portion of the corrupted part of her son. Consequently, she changed the head of Belitug into an owl, a nocturnal bird called a cup by the Ifugaos, whence the origin of the Kián custom of auguring evil from this bird, and the offering of sacrifices of fowls to Búgan, in order that no harm should come to them, and that the said owl should not return to them. The ears she threw into the forest, and for that reason there come forth on the trees certain growths, like chalk, half spherical, certain species of fungi. The nose she threw away and changed it also into a certain species of shell which attaches itself to trees. Of the half of the excrement she made the bill of a small bird called Ido, from which the Ifugaos augur well or ill, according to certain variations of its song. From the putrefied tongue she produced a malady or swelling of the tongue in men, which is cured with a hot egg, or with a chicken, which they offer to their mother, Búgan. From the bones of the breast she created a venomous serpent. From the heart she made the rainbow. From the fingers she made certain very long shells, after the form of fingers. From the hair, thrown into the water, she created certain little worms or maggots. From the skin she drew forth a bird of red color, called kukik. From the half of the blood she created the small bats, littlet. From the liver she drew forth a certain disease of the breast. From the intestines she formed a class of somewhat large animals, resembling rabbits or rats, immunin. From the bones of the arms she made pieces of dry or rotted wood that fall from trees upon passers-by who approach them. The Belitug that Búgan reanimated is in the sky region of Lugtag. The myth just given is an example of one of the most interesting processes in the early development of literature. It is probable that originally it was only a simple origin myth, but it has been elaborated and developed until now it is worthy of its little niche in the world's literature. Central Ifugao beliefs. The exact difference between the Central Ifugao and the Kián beliefs is not an easy matter to determine. There has been much mixture between the two peoples accompanied by a corresponding exchange of ideas. The effect of this exchange in some cases has been to produce a deceptive similarity in beliefs and myths that originally were fundamentally different, while in other cases myths that were originally the same have been so greatly differentiated in the two areas that their unity can scarcely be recognized. However, it would seem that some basic differences really exist, and the probability is that they are survivals from the ancient cultures of the peoples who went to make up the present distinctly composite Ifugao group. But the evidence at hand is not sufficient to warrant a full discussion of this question here, and I shall merely cite one example. Kián myths are nearly always told from the standpoint of the gods, and have to do with the dealings of the gods with one another and with men. On the other hand, Central Ifugao myths are told from the standpoint of men in their relations and dealings with the gods. This will be made plain by a comparison of the following Central Ifugao myth with the origin of the Ifugaos previously given. The Ifugao flood myth, the Golden Age. Ifugao knowledge of the Prediluvian period is very vague. It is known, however, that the earth world was entirely flat except for two great mountains, one in the east called Amuyao and one in the west called Kalauitan. This level country was heavily forested, and all of the people lived along a large river that ran through the central plain between the two great mountains. The period was something like a golden age, when things were much better than they are now. The people were demigods whose life was a happy one and their country a sort of Garden of Eden. To obtain rice, all that they needed to do was to cut down a stalk of bamboo, which was plentiful, and split open the joints which were filled with hulled rice ready to cook. Stalks of sugarcane were filled with bayaks, and needed only to be tapped to furnish a most refreshing drink. The river was full of fish, and the forests were filled with deer and wild hogs, which were much easier to catch than those of the present day. The rice grains of that time were larger and more satisfying, and a handful of them was sufficient to feed a large family. But this golden age, like others, was not destined to last. The flood, and the origin of the mountains. One year when the rainy season should have come, it did not. Month after month passed by and no rain fell. The river grew smaller and smaller day by day until at last it disappeared entirely. The people began to die, and at last the old men said, "If we do not soon get water, we shall all die. Let us dig down into the grave of the river, for the river is dead and has sunk into his grave, and perhaps we may find the soul of the river and it will save us from dying." So they began to dig, and they dug for 3 days. On the 3rd day the hole was very large, and suddenly they struck a great spring and the water gushed forth. It came so fast that some of them were drowned before they could get out of the pit. Then the people were happy, for there was plenty of water, and they brought much food and made a great feast. But while they were feasting, it grew dark and began to rain. The river also kept rising until at last it overflowed its bank. Then the people became frightened and they tried to stop up the spring in the river, but they could not do so. Then the old men said, "We must flee to the mountains, for the river gods are angry and we shall all be drowned." So the people fled toward the mountains, and all but 2 of them were overtaken by the water and drowned. The 2 who escaped were a brother and sister named Igon and Búgan, Igon on Mount Ihîk and Búgan on gggáuan. And the water continued to rise until all the earth world was covered excepting only the peaks of these 2 mountains. The water remained on the earth for a whole season, or from rice planting to rice harvest. During that time Igon and Búgan lived on fruits and nuts from the forests that covered the tops of the 2 mountains. Búgan had fire which at night lit up the peak of gggáuan, and Igon knew that there was someone else alive besides himself. He had no fire, and suffered much from the cold. At last the waters receded from the earth and left it covered with the rugged mountains and deep valleys that exist today, and the solitary brother and sister, looking down from their respective peaks, were filled with wonder at the sight. The repopulation of the earth world. As soon as the earth was dry, Igon journeyed to gggáuan, where he found his sister Búgan, and their reunion was most joyous. They descended the mountain and wandered about until they came to the beautiful valley that is today the dwelling place of the Banao clan, and here Igon built a house. When the house was finished, Búgan dwelt in the upper part and Igon slept beneath. Having provided for the comfort of his sister, Igon started out to find if there were not other people left alive in the earth world. He traveled about all the day and returned to the house at night to sleep. He did this for 3 days, and then as he was coming back on the 3rd evening he said to himself that there were no other people in the world but themselves, and if the world was to be repopulated it must be through them. At last Búgan realized that she was pregnant. She burst into violent weeping, and, heaping reproaches on his head, ran blindly away toward the east, following the course of the river. After traveling a long way, and being overcome with grief and fatigue, Búgan sank down upon the bank of the river and lay there trembling and sobbing. After having quieted herself somewhat, she arose and looked around her, and what was her surprise to see sitting on a rock near her an old man with a long white beard. He approached her and said, "Do not be afraid, daughter. I am Hinagán, and I am aware of your trouble, and I have come to tell you that it is all right." While he was speaking, Igon, who had followed his sister, appeared on the scene. Then Hinagán placed the sanction and blessing of the gods upon their marriage, assuring them that they had done right, and that through them the world must be repeopled. He told them to return to their house, and whenever they were in trouble to offer sacrifices to the gods. After Búgan had become convinced in this manner, they left Hinagán and returned home. In the course of time 9 children were born to Igon and Búgan, 5 sons and 4 daughters. The 4 oldest sons married the 4 daughters, and from them are descended all of the people of the earth world. The youngest son, who was named Igon, had no wife. The sacrifice of Igon. One year the crops failed, there was much sickness, and everything went wrong. Then Igon remembered the advice of Hinagán, and he told his sons to procure an animal for the sacrifice. They caught a rat and sacrificed it, but the evil conditions were not remedied. Then they went out into the forest and captured a large snake and sacrificed it to the gods, but the disease and crop failure still continued. Then Igon said, "The sacrifice is not great enough, for the gods do not hear. Take your brother Igon, who has no wife, and sacrifice him." So they bound Igon, and sacrificed him, and called upon the gods. And Hinagán came, and all the other great gods, to the feast. And they took away the sickness, and filled the granaries with rice, and increased the chickens, the pigs, and the children. Then Hinagán said to the people, "It is well, but you have committed an evil in spilling human blood and have thereby brought war and fighting into the world. Now you must separate to the north, south, east, and west, and not live together any more. And when ye have need to sacrifice to the gods, do not offer rats, snakes, or your children, but take pigs and chickens only." And one of the sons of Igon went to the north, and one to the south, and one to the east, and one to the west. And from them are descended the peoples of the earth world, who fight and kill one another to this day because of the sacrifice of Igon. Many other illustrations might be given of the differences between the Central and Kián Ifugao religious conceptions, but the above will suffice for the purposes of the present paper. One more type of Ifugao origin myth merits our attention before we come to the conclusion. This type consists of the myths invented to explain the origin of the ancient Chinese jars, bronze gongs, amber agate beads, and other rare articles of foreign manufacture on which the Ifugaos place a high value, and the origin of which they do not know. Many of these objects have been in the possession of the people for at least several hundred years. They were probably brought into the islands by Chinese traders centuries before the coming of the Spaniards, and gradually found their way to the Ifugaos through the medium of their cursory commerce with the surrounding peoples. One of these myths, explaining the origin of 3 well-known jars, runs as follows. Legend concerning ggílît of Hinagán and the jars that he brought from the village of Souls. A long time ago, before the coming of the Spaniards, there lived at Hinagán a man called ggílît. He was a wealthy man, possessing 4 rice granaries in a very large house, but he was not a priest. His constant desire was to hunt in the forest. One day ggílît went hunting in the forest and was overtaken by night. He called his dogs, but they did not come. He made fire, cooked, and ate. Then one dog came to him, and he took it and led and departed. Nearby he found a path. The dog with him barked, and the second dog answered, and they went on. And the dog with ggílît began to whimper and whine, and to pull on the leash, and ggílît ran, and they went on. Suddenly it became light all around them, and they came out of the forest into a large group of people. And the people said among themselves, "Surely ggílît is dead," and they examined his body and asked, "Where were you speared?" And ggílît spoke and said, "I have not been speared. I went hunting and was overtaken by night, and my dog here ran ahead on our path. I followed, and came here, and lo, it is light here." And they took ggílît and went to their town, for there are many large towns there in the dwelling place of souls. They wished to give him food, but he said, "Wait until my own food is exhausted, and then I will eat of your rice here." And they asked him, "How many days will you remain with us?" And ggílît answered that he would remain 4 days. Then the people began to laugh, and one of them said, "Not 4 days but 4 years here." "Ha!" cried ggílît, "I shall never do that. Wait until you see." "Just so," answered the other, "but 1 day here is the same as a year on the earth world." But ggílît thought that he was lying. ggílît visited all of the towns there. He worked in the rice fields, and they gave him 4 jars as his wages. Then his host said to him, "Return home now, for you have been here 4 days, which, according to the usage of the earth world, are 4 years. "Yes," answered ggílît, "I wish to go home now, as I am homesick for my family. You have been very good to me, for you have given me wages for my work." And the host said, "It was a gift, not wages, but a gift, that I gave you," and he led the way and pointed out to ggílît a ladder. "Go down that ladder, and in a short time you will arrive at your house," he said. ggílît started to go down, but one of the jars struck heavily against the ladder and was broken. He went down the ladder and at last arrived in the top of a betel nut tree. He slid down the trunk of the tree to the ground, and the chickens were crowing, and it was just dawn. And he looked at his surroundings and exclaimed, "Why, this is my own house." His relatives came out and said, "Who are you?" And he replied, "This is my house." They looked at him closely and cried, "Well now, it is ggílît who has been gone these 4 years." And they sat down and talked long together. He showed them the jars, and they asked, "Where did you get those?" And he answered, "I brought them from the sky world," and they were afraid and went to look for the ladder, but it was no longer there. The above myth may well have been invented by some man who, unknown to his relatives and friends, wandered across the mountains into Lepanto or Benguet and returned after 4 years with the jars in question. Hundreds of myths and legends of this type are current among the Ifugaos.